You may hear a slight buzzing noise in the background. Apologies for that. I'm not quite sure what's causing it. I think there's a slight crack on the bottom of my laptop. I have put sellotape on it, which should null the sound a little bit, but apologies if that's audible. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. So, I came across a video short which showed people in China uh, attacking statues, and this was a curious sight. These are statues of historic figures outside the mausoleum of a general by the name of Yu Fei, who died in the 12th century. This general Yu Fei is seen as a national hero. He was an important figure in the Song dynasty, and he was an important figure in the Song Jin Wars, which were dynastic wars of that period. But he's seen posthumously as a great hero in China. Now, the statues are prostrate, they're all kneeling outside his mausoleum, and they depict the figures of Qin Hui, Lady Huan, and two of Qin Hui's subordinates, Mo Shi and Zhang Jun. And what's notable about this is people actually come to this day and they physically hit the statues with shoes. They spit on them. Apparently, in the past, there was even people urinated on those statues. So they're sort of seen as a symbol of revulsion. They're sort of held up to be um, like an object of vitriol because they had betrayed this general and he was put to death on false charges. There's some uncertainty over exactly how he died, whether he was judicially executed, whether he was poisoned, but regardless, he suffered false accusations and and died. So they were reviled as a group that were responsible for that. Whether they actually were or not, it's hard to say. We're talking about events over 800 years ago. And one thing that's notable about Chinese history is there is a long track record of officials being scapegoats for a higher official, in this case, the Emperor Gao Zhong. Um, so it wouldn't surprise me if they are just scapegoats. I mean, it made me think of the Gang of Four under Chairman Mao. This is not to say that the Gang of Four were angels, but they were charged with the crimes that Mao perpetrated as figurehead. And there's a real paradox when it comes to Chairman Mao, because on one hand, if you press Chinese nationalists on this, they might concede that he made mistakes. And yet they also treat him almost like a living deity. So if he made mistakes, then he was fallible. There's a real contradiction in this. Um, but the cult of personality under Mao's China was such that he had the final say on what happened on his watch, because his power and his iron grip was such that no one would have dared go against Chairman Mao's orders. Um, I'm fascinated by Chinese history, and there's things I love about Chinese culture. One thing I do not respect and I have a problem with is the inherent hypocrisy. What I mean by that is we're talking here, this is just an example. By the way, it's in the city of Hangzhou, which is a beautiful city. I've been there. I didn't actually have the chance to see this site. I was there for a relatively short time, so I haven't seen this directly. But um, there is a real paradox. So figures that may or may not have been involved in a conspiracy, in a cover up, in a not a cover up, a frame up 800 years ago to this day get spat on, reviled. There's a sort of a metal frame around them. I don't know whether that's to protect the statues or not, but certainly they were erected specifically to shame them for eternity. Um, Yet Chairman Mao, who died 49 years ago, to this day, he is hailed, he's praised. He remains on Chinese RMB currency. His mausoleum is still visited by thousands of tourists, both Chinese and international alike. Um, and there's statues to him all over the country. There is a real paradox here. So ancient tyrants get vilified. Mao, who is the biggest tyrant of all, and not only the biggest tyrant in Chinese history, arguably the biggest mass murderer in human history, The only rivals I can think of that come anywhere close is perhaps Genghis Khan and a few others. Hitler, it depends how you count Hitler's death. Certainly, Hitler was a monster, but you have to factor in, is he responsible for all deaths in the European theatre of World War II? Certainly was mass killing outside of the Holocaust, so Hitler is high up there on the list of mass killers. But in terms of a single leader responsible for deaths under his policies, then Mao is pretty much near the top. Stalin, of course, also responsible for tens of millions of deaths. But Chairman Mao's policies, his efforts to destroy China in order to rebuild China in this kind of perverse communist logic, absolutely caused tens of millions of deaths, including the worst famine in human history between the years 1958 and 1961. It may have killed up to 40 million people. To put that in context, that's almost double the death toll of World War One. I mean, that's a staggering, staggering figure, or the population of a medium-sized country. It's truly a massive mortality rate. Um, and you always hear, Mao's apologists say, well, he must have been a good leader because China's population ultimately increased. But if that is the measure of greatness, if that disregard for human life is the measure of greatness, my goodness. Um, The Great Leap Forward was a catastrophe, but the Cultural Revolution was also a very dark period from the years 1966 to 1976. On that occasion, you had teachers literally beaten to death by their own students. You had mass suicides. I mean, we call them suicides, but really they could be seen as murders because people were hounded to that point. You had these struggle sessions where allegedly corrupt officials would be yelled at and effectively lynched. Anyone seen as an intellectual was targeted. It was a complete nightmare. And this was within living memory. We're not talking about the Dark Ages, we're talking about the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, this is incredible. So I do have a problem with that inherent hypocrisy of A, focusing on ancient tyrants whilst ignoring the crimes of Chairman Mao and also Xi Jinping, although Mao's worse. Um, and also, you find this narrative of Chinese nationals. They'll really, really home in on Japanese war crimes, which is understandable. Japan done some terrible things, absolutely. But also, they'll talk about the Opium Wars, they'll talk about European colonialism. But there is a fundamental dishonesty when it comes to communist crimes. Yes, Chairman Mao, but also more recently, Tiananmen Square and what the Communist Party has been doing in recent years. And when Chinese national students come to the West, they'll always insist that they don't just blindly agree with the Communist Party. They'll insist that they're not mindless ants and they don't go along with it. And yet they will also aggressively defend it. Why? Because it's their perceived notion of defending the motherland. Or if there's foreigners criticizing the Chinese government, we better defend it. So I think when you have extreme nationalism combined with a communist education system, it's a pretty toxic mix. I don't want to be misunderstood with this. There are honest Chinese out there who know history and who know, indeed, there's people who suffered under the Cultural Revolution personally. Um, they had relatives who were killed in struggle sessions and so on. They know the history, but the environment in China is still very difficult to speak out against that. I think the CCP, even though they themselves know that Mao was a problem, because he turned against his own party, he was an egomaniac, and he wanted all the power consolidated to himself. So his thing was to destroy the old guard of the Communist Party to rebuild it for himself. Despite that, today's Communist Party still holds him up, ostensibly because he's perceived as a strong leader, so that's good for them. Really, Mao should be seen as a weak leader. I don't think he was good for China. I think Deng Xiaoping, um, despite also having a pretty bad human rights track record, I think Deng Xiaoping was more of a pragmatist, less of an egomaniac. And ultimately, in terms of, I'm not talking about the human rights situation, but in terms of China's economic launch, Deng Xiaoping done far more than Chairman Mao. I mean, Chairman Mao destroyed China. When he died, it was still a very poor country. It's Deng Xiaoping that deserves credit for making China the major power it is today. Um, I think that this is something that until that changes, until the Chinese mindset towards defending Chairman Mao changes, then it's still going to be one of its Achilles' heels. It's still going to be a weakness. China's a powerful country, it's a confident, powerful country, but this is a fundamental weakness, this inability to be honest about its own history. If you look at European countries, we have debates about empire. I would contend that there is far more scope for debate in this country about the British Empire than there is in China about the crimes of communism. You know, you can criticize the empire, but the fact of the matter is we have hundreds, if not thousands, of books, documentaries, etc., discussing the wrongs of the British Empire. We even have a statue of Mahatma Gandhi in the city of Leicester, the very figure who rose up against the British Empire. Now, in what other country would you see that? A figure that rose up against the very empire being celebrated within that country. It's incredible. So I would argue that yes, you're going to get people who are in denial about some of the things we've done, but because there is more of a scope for debate, because we don't have a single party system, then there is simply more scope for debate there. Because China is a single party system, there's no ground for critical thinking. I'm not saying that people aren't objective individually. Lots of Chinese are intelligent, educated people, and I think they know full well this is the truth. But, you know, me saying this, I'm a foreigner, so, you know, we better be patriotic and criticize the foreigner because he dares to speak out. But this is the truth. So when I saw this, it kind of reminded me of the antics of the Red Guards in the 60s. It's not as bad. They are just statues, and the historic figures are clueless as to it's happening. But um, it really should be directed at Chairman Mao, yet his statues are worshipped. So you have this strange paradox of these four figures being vilified because of their betrayal and framing of one man versus a mass murdering tyrant who gets worshipped and praised by millions of people despite what he done in recent history. It's bizarre. So I do think there is an inherent hypocrisy in the way the Chinese approach Chairman Mao and his crimes compared to how they vilify ancient tyrants and how they always talk about the Opium Wars and the Japanese and so on. In the case of the Japanese, I'm a bit more understanding because it is more recent. Um, Japan's record, sometimes apologizing, sometimes not. But Chairman Mao killed more than the Japanese. That's the truth. Japan done some terrible things. There was the rape of Nanking, which is one of the worst war crimes of the 20th century. There were some appalling things, you know, entire villages buried alive, chemical warfare. Imperial Japan was wicked. Um, but there is a fundamental hypocrisy in focusing on that, but turning a blind eye to what Chairman Mao done. I mean, he caused more suffering to more Chinese, I would argue, than any outside force. Um, he also used the Japanese, incidentally, when they invaded Manchuria. Mao used it as a convenient way to exploit advantages over the nationalists. And he actually welcomed the Japanese advance because he knew it would weaken the Kuomintang government. Um, and it's forgotten, you know, that millions of Kuomintang troops fought and died fighting the Japanese. In fact, during World War II, they were the government that was in power, not the communists. And yet today it's the communists who take credit for the defeat of the Japanese. Well, it's a combination of factors. It's the Kuomintang and the massive sacrifices that they went through, along with the communists, um, along with allied efforts as well. But today's narrative is that they take all the credit, and I think that's unfortunate for Chinese Kuomintang troops who actually died fighting the Japanese. Their sacrifice is forgotten in mainland China.